perfect. Just perfect. I sat in a pool of milkshakes with sprinkles all over me while the love of my life stood there laughing his butt off at me. Hi, my name is Jane, and I'm going to tell you the craziest story you've ever heard. Part of it is that I fell in love with my dad's crush. It had started out like any other day. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and my dad was yelling his head off at me. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for Dad when he ran into the kitchen. "What's this?" He waved my science exam in my face. Oh, damn. Where did he get that?
That's the only way a stupid girl like you can make good money.
In fact, he often said that if I didn't pay back all the money he'd spent on me, he'd never let me get married.
You think I would let you get married and give him all the money you make for free?
Oh, no way! He then said I was grounded. I rolled my eyes and said I had to work. If I wasn't working, we didn't have any money.
Are you trying to rub it in my face?
My dad yelled as he angrily threw a plate at me. I ducked and it crashed into the window behind me. Whoops. Just as I turned around to leave, he said the worst thing I could hear.
"You're just like your useless mom."
Hearing this made me furious, and I yelled that if I was so useless, maybe I shouldn't work so many jobs and he could take care of me for a change. Then, without another word, I ran out of the house. It was time to go to work, and that was another drama altogether. My supervisor was a senior from my school, Martha. She was always picking on me, and I didn't even know why. She had been out to get me from my very first day. One time, a customer yelled at her for spilling his milkshake. The very next day, she tripped me and I spilled it in front of the same guy. But he nicely said it was okay. She was furious. She said it was because I was always flirting with boys. I was so embarrassed. As my shift was ending and I went about my work serving milkshakes and pizzas, the door opened and a huge crowd of kids from our school flooded in. My heart raced. Right at the front of the crowd was the school heartthrob, Alan. Alan was the king of football and my biggest crush in the world. He walked right up to me and said, "A milkshake for everyone, please." He smiled so warmly, I almost passed out. But my excitement was short-lived because suddenly Martha started calling me mean names. I was furious, so I turned around and yelled at her to stop being so horrible. For a minute, there was complete silence, and I thought maybe she would apologize. Instead, she said, "You're fired." I looked at her like nothing had happened and said, "Yeah, whatever. I'm glad you finally said it." Then I left. The next day, just as I thought the day was going perfectly, my dad walked in. He was walking funny and kept bumping into everything. Oh no, I thought, not here. I tried to crawl under the table, but he saw me and started yelling,
"There's my little piggy bank!"
He laughed loudly. I was close to tears. Thankfully, Mrs. Walker, my favorite teacher, stepped in and asked Dad to leave. But to my utter horror, he started flirting with her. But Mrs. Walker calmly stepped back and grabbed a jug of very cold water from a nearby table. Before my dad knew what was happening, she threw it in his face. Everyone laughed. Someone pointed at me and said,
"That's your dad, isn't it, Jane?"
Other people turned to stare at me. Furious, I ran to the one place I knew no one would be, the library. But I ran right into someone. I fell back with a cry. I looked up to see Bruce. I groaned. I didn't need this. Bruce was a high school dropout and a few years older than me. Everyone at school was terrified of him. But at that moment, he didn't look or act scary. He helped me up and asked me what was wrong. My frustration bubbled over, and I told him everything. He looked at me with serious eyes and simply said,
"My mom's like that. She sucks."
Somehow, the two of us became instant friends. He walked me home, and for a few days, we hung out together a lot. It was the best week of my life. But then it all came crashing down. One day, as I got home, I walked into the lounge and found my dad kissing a woman. "Ew, gross!" I yelled. They broke apart laughing, and the woman turned to look at me. She was really shabby looking. When she grinned at me, her teeth were yellow and dirty. "So this is the brat?" she asked Dad. She looked hard at me and said, "Looks more like a rat." The two burst into laughter. I rolled my eyes and went up to my bedroom. Clearly, this was a match made in heaven. A few hours went by, and someone started ringing the bell like crazy. I ran downstairs. I opened the door and saw Bruce. I asked him what was wrong, and he demanded to know where his mom was. "How could I possibly know? She's your mom," I laughed. He frowned and pushed past me into the house.
"I saw her come here,"
he said, and then showed me a picture of his mom. It was the bimbo from this afternoon. Oh my gosh! We started looking for her, but she wasn't here. Neither was my dad. I told him to wait with me. They'll be back soon, I said. But they didn't show up. He gave up and went home. The next day, when the bell rang, I rushed to the door, hoping it would be Dad. But it was a crowd of people. They all asked about my dad and said he'd borrowed thousands of dollars from them, and now he was nowhere to be found. Had Dad run away with their money? Just then, Bruce called and said his mom hadn't come home either, and people had shown up demanding their money. By the end of the week, Bruce and I were homeless, and we had no option but to try and rent a place between the two of us. Things were finally returning to normal. I had even started to develop a crush on Bruce and half expected him to declare his undying love for me any day now. But he didn't. But then something crazier happened. One day, as I was about to leave for work, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw a hot woman smiling at me. "No thanks," I said, thinking she was a saleswoman. But she hugged me and started to cry. She said she was my mom. I rolled my eyes and pushed her off. But there was no way this was my mom. She was so freaking hot. She showed me pictures of her and my dad. But it's not like I cared. I hated her. I told her to get out. "You don't care about me," I said, pushing her out the door. But just then, Bruce walked in and helped her up. He started to insist that we let her stay. I was disgusted and said that wasn't happening. But he said we could at least allow it for a few days. Mom just batted her eyelashes at Bruce and smiled flirtatiously. To my horror, Bruce blushed. I wanted to gag. The weeks following were a living hell. Mom had Bruce wrapped around her finger, and he practically wagged his tail every time he saw her. Then one day, Bruce announced he was giving the home to my mom. I was horrified. How could he do that without asking me first? But it was too late. The very next day, when Bruce and I got home, we saw Mom in the lounge with some guy 10 years younger than her. They were holding hands and smiling at each other. I started to laugh. Damn karma. Bruce tried to beat the guy up, but Mom laughed at them and kicked Bruce out. She said he'd served his purpose. Then she turned to me and smiled. "Sweetie, you can stay if you want." I rolled my eyes and went to my room. But living with Mom was horrible. She kept throwing huge parties at home. And every time she threw a party, I was locked up in a cupboard. The 5th time she did that, though. I got really mad, and the next morning, as she lay passed out on the couch, I called the cops. They took her and her stupid young boyfriend away. Now that I lived alone, I could finally focus on my college applications. I was in my senior year, and I was thrilled. But then, of course, something wacky happened. One day, I got home, and my mom was sitting inside. Ah! I demanded to know what she was doing there. She laughed and said she needed a place to stay. From the looks of it, she was never going to leave me alone. There was only one way to get rid of her and all the drama. I decided to leave town. When I turned 18, I decided to move away. But as soon as I arrived in a new town, I realized what a horrible idea it was. I was homeless again. But to my luck, as I roamed around outside the grocery store, I saw a very pretty girl, a few years older than me, looking at me. But suddenly, a boy pushed me to the ground and tried to run away with my bag. I jumped up, but to my surprise, the girl had already grabbed him and taken my bag from him. Then she came over to me and introduced herself. She said her name was Bella. I asked if she could help me look for a place, and she said, "Why don't you come live with me?" She said she was renting a place from an annoying man who was always trying to flirt with her. Then she laughed and said, "Well, I got lower rent because he has a crush on me." I laughed and agreed. When her landlord came, I was shocked to see that the creep was none other than my dad. Ew, gross! I almost attacked my dad when I saw him. "How could you just run away?" I demanded. He laughed and said, "I'll let you stay here instead." I was out of options, so I agreed. I asked him if he was still with Bruce's mom, and he rolled his eyes and said he was. "She finds me no matter how hard I try to get away." For a while, we stayed out of each other's way, and things were fine. Except that I had started crushing on Bella. She was so cute and dressed like a model, but there was nothing I could do about it. But when I came back from work one day, I was horrified to see Bella was reading my diary. My diary had everything in it about how much I loved her. She saw me come in, and I said I could explain, but she wouldn't stop laughing. Then she walked over to me and kissed me on the cheek and said she thought I was cute. But before I could respond, I heard a scream.
What's going on here?
It was Dad. He looked furious. He started to demand that I leave the house immediately or he would throw Bella out too. Bella looked at me sadly and said that I should leave. I was heartbroken, but I knew what I was going to do. I had looked up where Dad and Bruce's mom were living, so I ran straight over. I told her everything about how Dad had a crush on Bella. She was so angry, she literally grabbed a rolling pin and ran over to the apartment. We found Bella trying to kick Dad out, and Bruce's mom started chasing him all over the block. Then she said, "Don't bother coming home." Dad tried to apologize, but she wasn't having it. She said she was tired of his nonsense. Dad had no choice but to leave, as apparently the place was also under her name.
And you! She turned to me. If you want to stay, you best find me my son. I know he's in town.
After a few weeks, it finally occurred to me that the best place to look for Bruce would be the library. Sure enough, I finally found him. At first, he told me to get lost, but I told him his mom wanted him back and wanted to give him money. He agreed and followed me. To my horror, though, the minute he and Bella saw each other, they hugged. I stared at them. Bella was saying to him, "I missed you, babe." And Bruce was apologizing for breaking up with her. To make matters worse, Bruce turned to me and said,
Thank you for bringing us back together.
His mom appeared and said she'd promised to let me stay, so she would. I ended up moving into her house. Thankfully, she had changed a lot after Dad's horrible behavior, and I finally got a normal life. My own parents had completely disappeared from my life, and Bruce and Bella had started dating again. But I wasn't mad. I was just looking forward to a normal college experience.